Let me introduce our second speaker this morning, my dear friend Rosalind Morris, professor of anthropology at Columbia University. I first came across Rosalind's work when I read an article that she published in 2008 titled "The Miner's Ear" on the oral or sonic dimensions of mining and its history in South Africa. I was struck by how she paid attention to the folds of language, let's say, the echoes between the oral, what can be heard, and the auriferous, the gold bearing. And also, by the way, she lent an attentive ear to the bodies that are entangled in these linguistic structures or folds. The miner's lung, she writes, is the withering, deflating double of the ear. The article was beautifully punctuated or counterpointed with charcoal drawings by William Kentridge. And I later discovered that Rosalind has been working closely with William Kentridge. They have published a series of conversation in 2013, That Which Is Not Drawn. And in 2015, they wove together, so to speak, images and narrative in order to produce a beautiful volume titled Accounts and Drawings from Underground, based on the financial records of a gold mine in South Africa. Rosalind has written decisive essays and articles on questions ranging from primitive accumulation in Marx to performance theory and the anthropology of sex and gender, Derrida's legacy, torture, identity politics in the humanities, to name just a few. She has edited memorable volumes like Can the Subaltern Speak? Reflections on the History of an Idea, Columbia University Press 2010. Rosalind is also the author of 2 opera librettos, and she has directed the prize-winning documentary We Are Zama Zama about migrants who risk their lives scavenging for gold in the ruins of South Africa's deep industrial mines. Her latest book, Unstable Ground, The Lives, Deaths, and Afterlives of Gold in South Africa, is forthcoming with Columbia University Press, along with a poetry collection, For Lack of a Dictionary, forthcoming with Fordham University Press. The title of Rosalind's talk is Enclosures, the Letter and the Envelope of Reading.
I'm sorry, I have a little bit of a frog this morning in my throat, but if you have trouble hearing me, just wave your hands. I want to start by thanking Peter Zendi for the invitation to join you all today. Whenever I get an email, I don't know if I call it a letter, from Peter telling me that there's going to be an event here, I become, joyous with anticipation, because the conversations are always so rich, they're always so profound, and they're always so generously stewarded. And that has been the case so far, and will be this afternoon, I'm sure, as well. But I'm very grateful. Thank you for including me. And after this beautiful, elegant talk this morning by Thomas, I feel like we're going to have the experience of the double column, the session as double column. And maybe that's a good thing, because I will ask you to think with me about what it means to move between the literal, literarity, the letter, as one moves in and out of the disciplines of literary critical reading. And I'm an interloper in this field, and it's always lovely to be an interloper. It's not so lovely for everyone who has to host the interloper. I hope that I won't be too obscure, and I'll try not to speak too long. So this is the story of a purloined letter. Not the one that Poe imagined, and that Baudelaire translated, secreted and coveted at the same time the letter whose treatment solicited the mimetic desire and resentments and anxieties of his characters, nor that other one, which may or may not have been the same one, that Lacan saw as the narrativized figure of the signifier in the dramaturgy of the subject's formation and subjection to the symbolic, the one that Derrida disdained for its idealizations. And not Jane Austen's letters received in the violet glow of the postal hour, nor the sun-blistered, temporally distended letter of Madame de Maintenon, not even Melville's dead letters, though all of these will be there in the background. I won't invoke these many letters yet, not before contemplating other letters and the nature of the envelope on which, to borrow the phrasing of our organizer, the address appears in the form of an addressee and a particular destination, as well sometimes as a possible site at which the sender might receive it back, or something else in return. I will come to those questions and the question, for whom does one read, in order to imagine the always already social, which is not to say public, and dispersed nature of reading. But I want to start in a colonial context that has not yet ended the effort to bring colonialism to an end. It happens to be where I spend a great deal of my time and where I have done so for nearly 3 decades. I'm speaking of South Africa and the gold mining regions whose constitution was enabled by mandated oscillating labor migration, designed and implemented by the monopsonistic as well as monopolistic Chamber of Mines, and effectuated in law by the various states that successively governed the gold-rich region of the Witwatersrand, so the Boer Republic, the Republic of Transvaal, the Union of South Africa, the Republic of South Africa, in its apartheid and post-apartheid iterations. I'm going to speak literally about letters in an apparently unlettered world. It is a world made by means of letters patents, those proclamations that delimit the status and or rights of a person, a corporation, office, monopoly, or government. The officially public status of these proclamations allows them to be read to and for anyone under the jurisdiction of a given head of state, whether monarch or representative body. In South Africa, these letters patents were also the means by which large numbers of people, categorized as non-European, Black, Native, Indian, African, colored, or mixed race, were precisely denied rights, offices, and territories. The most famous of these is probably the Native Land Act of 1913, which limited Black people's rights to own land, prohibited their sale and purchase of land, and confined them to a mere 7% of the Union's territory, a number that was only slightly enlarged to 13%. And that law, shocking to say this, was not replaced until 1991. While granting monopolies and rights to territories for some, these acts underwrote the infamous system of mandatory oscillating labor migration on which the colonial and then apartheid economies were grounded. This system proliferated laws, but also letters of a different sort, namely private missives, between migrant laborers and their families or kraal-based communities in natal or assigned territories. And assigned territories may have had nothing to do with where people originated, but they were based on the presumption that they were the location of ethno-national groups. Such people, forced to move between places of work and residence, often hundreds of kilometers apart, were otherwise separated by law and time in seasonal and unseasonal rhythms of absence and presence and absence. Because the letters patent also ensured the unlettered status of some by depriving Black people of access to all but technical education, every effort to speak literally, which is also and necessarily literarily, about the reading of letters in South Africa seems to run aground on questions of who reads what or whom. Consider the discourse of a man whom I have described and named in my book Unstable Ground as Virgil Umholi. Virgil because he was my guide, Umholi as a Zulu reduplicative of that concept. I met him in the ruined residential quarters of a gold mine that ceased operations in 1992 on the cusp of South Africa's transition to democracy. The gold in this area had been discovered in 1887, and the mine had been established in 1898, more than 100 years before we met in its ruins. Virgil Umholi's narrative of the mine's history features in my film, We Are Zama Zama, but that film doesn't include his discussion about the only man, other than his brother, for whom he provided a biography. This was the postman. Now, this man, whose residence, the postman, whose residence now stood vacant and overgrown by grasses, had been the courier who ferried messages from the nationally mediated outside world into the private pseudo-state of the mine compound. And I quote my interlocutor, "He got the letters that came from the rural areas from the post office. Yes, from the post. He delivered them right to the doorsteps. This was his place," he said, pointing to this abode. "He used to sleep there." Thus did Virgil Umholi, his arm outstretched and pointing to the evacuated abode, introduce the compound Hermes. Sorry, I've lost a page there. These beautiful hotel printers where everything comes out so neatly. Let me repeat that sentence. Thus did Virgil Umholi, his arm outstretched and pointing to the evacuated abode, introduce the compound Hermes, messenger of impossible communications and patron of travelers. It was difficult not to be moved by Virgil Umholi's recollection of this enchanting medium. In the context of oscillating, or as it was called by apartheid apologists, cyclic migrant labor, this moment of his discourse condensed an entire psychosocial structure in which individuals' attachments to their ikaya, their natal homes, were both stretched to the limit and somehow preserved. It was at once the supplement and the narrative transposition of a vast infrastructural network, including the railways and highways on which migrants continue to move and that sustain generations in the strange institution and double consciousness of what social scientists have called South Africa's peasant proletariat. Much of the scholarly literature on this migration, and especially that written under the influence of structural Marxism or other forms of dialectical materialism, has been either focused on the political economic dimensions of this system and its function in the repression of wages, or, somewhat more rarely, it has turned to the subjective experience of migrancy to find evidence of a normative sense of belonging that is affixed to the value of a rural origin. In such analyses, the system is then held accountable for the destruction of normative family life and forms and the gerontocratic and masculinist hierarchies associated with them. On the one hand, these two typically distinct approaches were appropriate to the time, this is emerging in the 1970s, in which the task of critique in South Africa demanded an analysis of the ruses by which so-called cyclic migrancy functioned as a technique of governance that simultaneously repressed wages and excluded Black subjects from access to urbanity and the forms of publicness that accompanied it, including full participation in the polis. On the other hand, in the effort to overcome the destructive forces of so-called cyclic migration, these approaches led from the 1980s onward to a politics of what was called stabilization, replacing the single-sex hostel system with peri-urban residential developments and living out allowances, which could not help but re-instrumentalize women while reinvesting the concept of the family. The purpose of these processes was to overcome a supposedly castrated masculinity. In this process, as I said, the architects of stabilization mobilized all the tropes, figures, and narratives of castrated masculinity that readers of Poe's purloined letter from Lacan to Derrida, Barbara Johnson, and others have found in this tale. No letter, now I speak of the missive, no letter could substitute for this loss. But was this a loss or a diversion? You may here recall Lacan's critique of Baudelaire's translation of purloined as volé, or stolen, and his insistence that the term purloined is in English more like put aside than stolen, in a word diverted from its normative path, its assumed destination. It is, he says, Lacan says, to be in sufferance. Now, Virgil Unholy's remarks about the postman's delivery of letters right to the doorsteps, a phrase he repeated many times, almost reverentially, suggested something often overlooked in accounts of both letter writing, in the histories of African literacy, and the logic of the postal system more generally. Namely, that the state-mediated structures within which letters circulate, as a strange kind of public secret and an equally strange form of territorialized address, are in some places also incarnated in an intimate encounter between otherwise unrelated people. This encounter between people who are not quite strangers, in Georg Simmel's sense of the term, has its own significance, quite beyond the relationship between the senders and receivers of letters. Their habitual and routinized meetings, the salutations and friendly exchanges at the doorstep, the queries about family members and shared gossip about neighbors, the reports of police activities, corporate news, and strikes, can seem to enact a quality of small-town life between the postman and the recipient of the letter. But in the urban and peri-urban spaces of the minds, their nature is rather different. Untethered from the totality of inhibiting forces that operate in more delimited communities of face-to-face interaction, they are not only consoling simulacra, but also mediating figures in which the opposed worlds of the rural village and the urban meet and are, or rather were, briefly but deceptively reconciled. Now, such mediation is deeply desired, and it is also a source of exposure and vulnerability, especially when the recipient of the letter cannot read it. If Virgil Unholy recalled the postman with fondness, the narrative of the postal hour of the minds is suffused with ambivalence in many other accounts. Consider these lines from a southern Sutu Lifela, sung by Sarami Tushwani, first recorded in 1982. Illiteracy is a sad matter. Your letter is read by someone at the chimney. You know what? He laughs in front of the letter owner. He remarks, "As for your news, I understand it, sir. They report starvation, lack of clothing, cornworms in the fields over there." Now, Sefela is a genre of sung verse narrative that was created and developed by Sutu migrants to the mines, with Lifela or Difela indicating individual compositions. As described with verve and insight by David Copeland, Sefela are often practiced in competitive form. They are full of vivid descriptions and trenchant criticism of migrant life, and they are appreciated for their ribald jokes and their translingual play. There's a beautiful line in this area in which people speak about, or describe the most virtuous of, or the most desired, rather, form of repartee, and it takes the form of this statement, "I could kill you with words and you wouldn't even know it." That is the mark of true verbal mastery. Now, the historian, referring to the public reading of an intimate missive as a moment of collaboration, will perhaps respond to such songs whose oral performance underlines the very dilemma of the sad matter of alphabetic literacy, with an exploration of the complex simultaneity of literacy and illiteracy, or of constrained literacy among migrant laborers. And these are the terms of the discourse on literacy in the history of South Africa. Such a historian, she or he, will remind us that people often have access to written culture even when they cannot themselves read or write, thanks to reading aloud, a fact that is never captured by literacy statistics any more than is the nature of the literacy that is ostensibly revealed by those statistics. Indeed, a rich, if small, body of scholarship addresses this very question, focusing on the fact that, from the earliest days, letters were an important part of life on the mines, given the centrality of migrant labor there. It played a special role in courtship and marriage, as well as in the relationships between parents and their children, despite low levels of alphabetic literacy, low levels that were legally predetermined and overdetermined. The significant role of amanuenses and the sometimes playful, sometimes conspiratorial practice of collective love letter writing, as well as the public reading of letters and the corollary dissociation of writing from interiority and lyricism in the formation of a South African literary culture and private sphere, have been well analyzed, for example, by Keith Breckenridge. He notes that early labor recruiters for the mines complained of having to write hundreds and even thousands of letters for the men and to supply them with paper, envelopes, and stamps. In fact, these items were budgeted as staples when labor recruiters drew up their estimates of costs for importing workers from China during the brief period of substitutional labor importation in the early 20th century. That they were there alongside of rice and other absolute necessities as what would be needed in order to keep migrant laborers docile. Almost all of these many thousands of letters have been lost or intentionally destroyed by their owners, but a few have entered the archive. The extant letters, including the bitter epistles between lovers and parents about the need for money, the humiliation of passbooks, and the longing for food, such as those collected by Isaac Shapira in Depression-era Bechuanaland, have been read with impeccable fidelity by analysts who have sought the letters' origins and mode of creation, their social conditions of possibility, and their political consequences. And these are necessary and instructive pursuits. But it is not the origin of the letter, however, nor its evidentiary function in an analysis of the past that interests me here. For Virgil Umholi's story about the postman demonstrates that the letter that comes from the past has not been left behind. The letter survives its sending, and this survival exceeds the matter of the paper object or the ink inscribed on its surface. It survives beyond the opposition of presence and absence, just as the experience of migrancy is irreducible to the question of presence or absence in one place or another. In its survival, the story and thus the memory of the postman bears the stamp of migrancy as a force that displaces and decenters subjects, that fragments and doubles them, while installing loss in the innermost recesses of consciousness. Now, this sensation of loss exceeds any particular loss, and even the accumulation of many losses. In this context, it is particularly notable that in Virgil Umholi's narrative, the letter appears only through the cipher of the postman, in whom it is displaced. This displacement permits it to signify the structure and psychic burden of the alienation accompanying migrancy, as well as the partial transfer of social relations from one place to another, albeit in a distended and diverted manner. Moreover, the social connection emphasized by Virgil Umholi does not lie at the origin of the letter's writing. His entire discourse was focused on the moment of receiving letters from the postal system's representative. This is the point of contact. It is the occasion that excites his narrative, which may partly explain the genial tone of his discourse in our encounters. For the story functions as a kind of allegory of connection in general, a quality that survives as abstraction precisely in the moment that it is threatened with destruction in actuality. In this allegory, the postman is the incarnation of that which has been transformed, although not entirely effaced. The world of face-to-face sociality, of actual relation. He is the signifier for and the embodiment of the migratory system, and in this respect, he provides the human visage or mask and the mythic mediation for a historical process that was profoundly dehumanizing, even if migration could and would be appropriated by some in the idiom of mobility as a source of authority and an object of desire. To grasp the importance within Virgil Umholi's narrative, it may help to recognize just how bleak and desperate were many of the migrants' letters received by Isaac Shapira, or cited by Isaac Shapira, and that others have described. I give you a few citations. "I am sick, my child. I have nothing to say except starvation," commences one such letter. Many of the missives Shapira invokes were concerned with economic exigencies, or the erotic longing, fears of infidelity, and concerns about pregnancy that are made so acute by temporary absence. But it is the anguish of the letters reporting deprivation and distress that stand in most obvious contrast to Virgil Umholi's cheerful remembrance of the postman's deliveries. Another of the letters that Shapira has anthologized reads, "I myself am sick. I am suffering from an ailment of the chest. I am unable to eat, and I am weakened by emptiness from hunger." More recent examples of the Lifela recorded by David Copeland are equally searing. Here is one of Tokola Lecheko, which describes the arrival of a letter from my mother, the kind-hearted mother. She solicits her son, "Come home, my child. Come home and get married." But then the sweet memory gives way in Lecheko's verse to caustic sarcasm. "If poverty were contested, God would be tied up endlessly in court. We would sit in high court against him." And the verse then bears a citation. "Poverty is eliminated by hard work only." Ends the citation in the verse. This is a lie. They deceive us. In this Lifela, the possibility of justice becomes the farce of a courtroom, and the hope for a liberating judgment is absorbed by the specter of bureaucratic entanglement. The punchline remains, but the indictment of duplicity brings with it a recognition of having been duped. Such acid which characterizes, as I said, so much of the verse narrative of this genre, has its less ludic counterpart in the more direct accusations of revolutionary poets like Peter Abrahams and Mzizi Kunene, who writes, "They have deceived themselves. They have deceived one another." Kunene's poem, White People, culminates with the derisive conclusion that, and I quote here, "They are also scared. They know they are like this because of the fairy tales. Because of the fairy tales they tell the nations." End quote. Such derisiveness is utterly absent, again, in Virgil Umholi's avuncular discourse, and he had long ceased moving back and forth between the compound and any home village elsewhere. A certain pathos is evident in the fact that his affectionate memory of a vital relation was prompted by our sojourn in the ruins, and that it recalled a time of extreme structural violence with the sense of its relative plenty. This tells you how desperate things are now. His nostalgia was not a valorization of the ruins, however. If Virgil Umholi discerned a beauty in this vanished and vanishing world, it was of the sort that Walter Benjamin describes in the moment that the storyteller is displaced within the newly technologized order of information. His concern his narrative attention to the postman rather than the letter writers expressed a longing not for immediacy, but precisely for mediation. For the sociality of the compound, however inhospitable, was its material routine. This was perhaps acknowledgement of all the letters' insufficiency. Now, the postman of Virgil Umholi's narrative is dead. His house is mere rubble. But even if he had been alive at the time that we spoke, his function would have become obsolete. It had been displaced by the cell phone in the mid-1990s, when cellular technology had enabled people who had previously been unable to access a limited supply of landlines to partake of the telephonic revolution, if they could afford it. That development transformed the lives of migrants and the entire social field in ways that would have to be explored somewhere else. Initially, it seemed to bypass the question of literacy and to tighten the temporal circuit within which communication occurs. And it's in this context that the significance of the postman as a sign of the past, and perhaps of pastness itself, and not merely of migrancy, emerges. Now, if I have lingered here with Virgil Umholi's story of the compound Hermes, it is because he is not only the remembered emissary of news from home, but also the cipher and metasign for a general structure at the center of which is migrancy. He is also the bearer of and a figure for what Derrida has called the postal principle, which afflicts not merely the literal letter, but also socio-historical processes in general. Inscribed in and by language, they exceed their intended purpose, not merely because they are, and I quote here, delivered to a future that may transform, corrupt, or delete them, as Hagelin would have it, summarizing Derrida, but because, in addition to being real institutional forms and practices, they also have a phantasmatic dimension. In South Africa, this can be said of both the idea of gold and the concepts of racial difference on which colonialism, apartheid, and segregationism in general were erected, and that together produced the regime of oscillating labor migration evoked in Virgil Umholi's narrative. That's the subject of my book, and we won't be able to discuss it here. I want to remain with the letters and switch registers a bit, though I will not come back to this column, despite my desire to do so. You may ask what is purloined in or of these letters, which appear all too public, their contents entirely exposed, albeit with shameful and shaming consequences for many. Is it this very publicness that diverts them from their presumptive function in an account of reading as interiorization, modeled on the figure of the reader reading to herself? This would require us to straddle the discursive boundaries in which reading takes place and in which the question of for whom one reads assumes its different valences. Now, this figure, or this mode of reading in which the reader reads to and for herself, is one for which I have an enormous amount of affection, and I am enchanted by its history. But I would say here that it cannot be the basis of a discovery, that such solitude and its inward direction, or complicity with the notion of the self-same, is a ruse, only to restore us to an ethics of the addressee, an openness of the other. So here is my problem, which I ask for your assistance in negotiating. And I hope that you will understand it as not mine alone. Here is my problem as I try to shift this reading of the letters between the question of the literal, the literary, the literalized, and so forth. In order to summon an expanded archive and history of what reading as address to the other might be, in order to take into account and to take account of this history, with all its violences as well as its pleasures, its anticipations and anxious receipts, its resentments and rages. In order to do this, I have to do what I did at the beginning of this essay, namely, read or claim to be reading literally. The result is, and this is a strange kind of literality, because it is that kind of reading which is, in some ways, not reading the letter, but rather the fact of the letters, the fact of their movement. The result is a double bind, in which the African migrant laborer, including both the mine worker and the domestic servant, enter this scene as bearers of a literality, a literalness, an illiteracy, as bearers of a literality that is entirely correlated with their exclusion from alphabetic literacy and the effacement of their own forms of reading and addressing others. Of course, both migrant laborers and domestic workers were writing or having letters written. Both were receiving and having letters read to and from the kinspeople and community members from whom they were forcibly absented. And both were reading other things in other ways. But in reading these letters as relatively transparent instances of a reading for others, am I, therefore are we, repeating the accusation of fetishism to which people in Africa, which we will not call Africans, have been subject for so many centuries, an accusation of mistaking the material locus and form of appearance, i.e. the signifier, of power for its origin in a relay whose actual source is the other, now with a capital O. Outside of psychoanalytic discourse, such accusations imply a colloquial understanding of literality and literalism, namely the inability to account for the metaphoricity of the metaphor. How not to fall into the trap of making Africa, really sub-Saharan Africa, the locus of a literalism in its colloquial sense, which is to say captation by the non-symbolic, the imaginary. As it has been discoursed upon since the 16th century at least, this imaginary would not be that of literature in its fully institutionalized sense, as it is for Freud in Derrida's reading. Rather, it would be a kind of failed reason, or even an unreason, in which the distinction between literary fiction and fairy tale, between narrative and just a story, goes unremarked. And here lies the whole history of fetishism's discourse and the Africanist's obsession with animism, necromancy, witchcraft, and so forth. Kuneni's critical verse seems to transpose the accusation of delusion by the fairy tale, which he attributes to whites. And he is writing as a modern figure of modern South African literature, but not of belles lettres. There is perhaps one obvious way out of this, and that is to make the African the signifier of the universal, and perhaps even the originary, rather than the marginalized and excluded other. Then the question of the signifier and its role in the production of the subject would not be foreign to Africa, but originating there. But that is a kind of ethical mandate and not an analysis, and it remains immune to history and thus complicit with an old Hegelian troping of Africa as being without history, except insofar as it is colonized. So, we are talking about a history of enclosures in every sense, and this is true of my own discourse. Even when one speaks literally, these enclosures are ambivalent. They entail the severance of relation and the desire and even demand for relation. They include the coerced inclusion into a specific form of alphabetic literacy and the exclusion from a pedagogy of reading that would permit it to be an opening to others rather than an enclosure within otherness deprived of alphabetic literacy. We can understand the enclosure to be that which makes the signifying chain possible only insofar as we recognize that this chain is interested and it is structured in particular ways under changing regimes of gendering, racialization, and ethnicization. So let us try and work this impossible, porous, non-boundary between the literal and the literary. One of the forms of enclosure is reading, the reading of a text of others. And this enclosure is most radical, most violent, most enclosing when it is performed for another treated as absolutely other, a status produced in South Africa in and through letters patents. I have just said that these enclosures were ambivalent, that they entailed severance and the desire for relation. We could call such enclosures contextualization and decontextualization. But let us note that in the realm of information, what the letters movement make possible is not relation, with its perduring obligations and daily interactions, presumptions of reciprocity, and sense of both future and past obligation. No, in the realm of information, the letters do not signal connection or even reconnection. Or rather, the letters become connection and mere reconnection. Confusing connection with relation is one of the risks of moving between the literal and the literary reading, or certainly that kind of literary reading that borrows its concepts, methods, practices, and modes of reading from psychoanalysis and the discourse of the signifier. So let me try and explain what I mean in the insistence that there is a risk in turning to psychoanalysis, a risk that I cannot fully resist, of the figure of return. A figure of return as connection and reconnection. I come back to the question of reading and even of the reading. In a particularly uncanny moment from my perspective of his seminar, Lacan refers to the purloined letter not only as that which has been diverted from its assumed path, but as an exemplary fictive instance of the principle by which the signifier, and I quote, sustains itself only in a displacement comparable to that found in electrical news strips or in the rotating memories of our machines that think like men, so linked, this machines that think like men, this because of the alternating principle, which is its principle. This because of the alternating operation, which is its principle, requiring it to leave its place, even though it returns to it by a circular path. The computing machine might therefore offer a simultaneously anticipatory and belated figure of extractive capitalism in its mode of cyclic migration. But this gesture risks naturalizing the migratory cycle precisely to the degree that Lacan reads the letter, the signifier, as always having a destination, at least insofar as the subject traversed by the signifying chain is concerned. Such a scenario is what Lacan refers to, following Freud, as repetition automatism. I'm not going to follow or go down the path of those from Derrida to Zizek who have questioned this presumption of destiny. I think we know, that not all signifiers reach their destination, and that if they do, what is received is not always what is sent, or at least what is not imagined to be sent. The mountains of undelivered missives in all the dead letters offices of the world are full of evidence of this fact, if one is thinking literally. These dead letters offices are the loci, if one is thinking less literally, of a textuality whose borders are unmarked, neither concealed nor entirely forgotten, though the question of concealment and forgetting is, in this sense, no longer a matter of the subject. In the dead letters office, one might say, there is the figure of a textuality, but not of a work. There is merely the operation of a bureaucratic machinery watching over a radically dispersed anticipation without end. Is it for the future or for a return? If we read the work as that artificially enclosed object, now this is the work of literature perhaps, but also any work, if we read the work as opposed to work as that artificially enclosed object, whose encryption Derrida has taught us to read in the name or title of the work, and that often goes under the signature of an author, If we do that, the analysis of the migrant laborers' prosthetically inscribed missives are invariably read, in their mode of reading and writing, as evidence of a form of labor that makes, say, the illusions, delusions, and heroic self-narrations of a Robinson Crusoe impossible. And this discussion of Crusoe in Derrida's The Beast and the Sovereign is where this argument about the encrypting function of the title vis-a-vis the work occurs. The writer of a letter, of the migrant laborer's letter, the writer of such a letter is invariably dissolved into the social type of migrant labor, as indeed I have performed for you. And the body of such works are equally invariably dissolved into an analysis of genre, or as perhaps as evidence of alienation. And such readings have their place. But in giving a reading of this genre, or indeed the history of this social type, one is already partaking of the problem to which this conference has directed us. What does it mean to read, and for whom does one give a reading of such letters? I put the matter literally. Now, literarity becoming the gesture of a certain literariness. In what sense is a reading given? Is it a gift, whether generous or poisonous? The reading at the chimney already provides us with a mise en scène, a situation in place and in history where the possibility of being for others is realized and where it reaches its limit. This chimney is the protuberance of an underground extractive industry, a center of a compound, a meeting point, and a locus of oration, a theater of severance from home and strained connection with it, of shame and renown. And once again, and with Derrida's critique in mind, but unable to relinquish the letter of this text, I recall a line from Lacan's essay with which I prefaced this talk. Quote, the narration, sorry, I don't even think I did preface this. I give it to you now, belatedly. It was there all along. The narration, in fact, doubles the drama with a commentary without which no mise en scène would be possible. Lacan continues here as follows. Let us say that the action would remain, properly speaking, invisible. In other words, nothing of the drama could be grasped, neither seen nor heard, without, dare we say, the twilighting, which the narration in each scene, he's speaking of Poe's letter, casts on the point of view that one of the actors had while performing it. Nothing of the drama could be grasped, neither seen nor heard, without the twilighting which the narration in each scene casts on the point of view that one of the actors had while performing it. Now, this narration is, in more senses than one, the discourse of the other. But the scenario of the publicly read letter in at the mind compound chimney permits us to grasp the question of the addressee as necessarily dispersed and even diverted. It is at once an instance of opening and closing, to the extent that the recipient and the social worlds to which he or she is being sutured by the letter are exposed. This enclosure is a kind of affirmation of a social bond. To the extent that she or he is ridiculed, this scene becomes one of differentiation and even disidentification on the part of the reader, reading for, on behalf of, the one who is receiving what cannot be read. To the extent that the letter is deemed, tragic, or that the predicament of the letter writer is seen to be oppressed, a different social bond is summoned, and often there is a tendency toward identification on the part of the reader, who, as we have seen, is also giving a reading in the act of enunciation, whether through meta-commentary, as one sees in the Sefela that I've cited, or in tonality and gesture of delivery. Now, the anthropologist, like the literary critic, although you may be wondering, now the anthropologist like the literary critic, and borrowing from her, is also giving a reading, and thereby both enclosing and opening the letter as a signifier for one or another discourse in which functions will be discerned and truth claims made. So too, the reader in the Sefela is reading the letter and giving a reading of the situation, the mise en scène of colonial extractive capitalism and its immiserations. In that tradition, too, a Lefela bears the name of a poet-singer whose mastery of rhetoric, rhyme, and rhythm will elicit praise or scorn from those to whom he or she, both women and men perform this genre, to whom she or he addresses their art, which will acquire the status of a work, partly by being enclosed in an ethnography in which it is accorded that status. This is a highly formalized genre in which every performance is to be read as a rereading and a transcendence of what has been read. Now, the question of the already read is ever present in our time and in all the pedagogical scenarios in which we operate. But the already read is not always the prejudged or the prejudicially read. It is also the condition of possibility of recognition. This is one of the dimensions or the corollaries of Derrida's argument for archewriting, not only writing before enunciation, but a reading before reading aloud. There's a long tradition in South Africa of what are known as praise songs, orature typically performed by recognized artists who serve as the mediums of critical discourse and who are granted the right and responsibility of voicing suspicion as well as recognition of the deeds of political authorities. Historically, praise songs were unsigned, and even the most empowered chiefs dared not demand retribution for criticism from a praise singer, because it was the function of the praise singer or mbongi to articulate collective interests and to hold power accountable. The praise singer was not the locus of an indivisible voicing attributable to a single individual. The praise singer was a carnal multitude, a medium for a moral history coming into articulateness. In recent years, this function has become an authorial one, and as that has occurred, the form has become more and more narrowly laudatory, because one can hold the author responsible for the judgment. Political events and literary festivals often open with a praise song to the convener, and these are adulatory addresses or avowals of moral principles, rather like the inaugural poems of American presidential ritual. But the letters recounted by the singers of Sefela, while related, are not of this order. They are correlated and co-emergent with migrancy, the symptom of movement and dispersal, if not mobility. As I said, that movement was called cyclic in apartheid discourse, which endlessly mobilized the fantasy of a return to a never having existed integrity, coherence, unicity, homogeneity, whatever one wants to call it. Bantustans, reservations, homelands were the sites at which this never having existed integrity, homogeneity was to be located and to which workers were to return at the end of their contracts. Those spaces, of course, becoming the locus of a very specifically gendered labor of maintenance, of waiting, of making do with less than is necessary. So, this movement was called cyclic in apartheid discourse. A more accurate term is oscillating, as I've already suggested. And here we might do well to remember Derrida's lacerating critique of Lacan's reading of the purloined letter, which he accuses, as I said, of idealization. In La Carte Postale, he discerns in Lacan's seminar an effort to lay claim to the truth and to a mastery of the truth. And I quote, "The system of the truth, which is the condition for a logic of the signifier, consists in what is non-exposable." This is Derrida's reading of Lacan's reading of the purloined letter. This mastery depends on what is not on someone mastering what is non-exposable. This is because, says Derrida, Lacan is guilty of phonocentrism. Lacan's, quote, symbolic occurs only within vocalizable letters, writes Derrida. For him, of course, there is a writing before speech, and this writing is irreducible to phonetic alphabetization. It is to be discerned in every conventionalization of the mark that permits the recognition of the word, or rather the text in its différance. For anything to return to itself, it must be, in Derrida's analysis, indivisible, immune to partition. This is why he can argue that Lacan is an idealist. He has to imagine a materiality that cannot be subject to fragmentation, partition, dissolution, or dispersion. He therefore gives us the discourse of diversion, which strangely enough consolidates the object as detachable but not divisible, as a lost but phantasmatically whole thing. And of course, the figure of this indivisible thing is the letter. This rhyming thing, which is not, in the end, the epistle. Perhaps, you will say, this is the point at which the homology, analogy, and perhaps even the possibility of an identity between the letter as the alphabetic signifier and the thing sent in an envelope, the thing read aloud at the chimney, whose very reading undoes the postulation of a vectoral tendency in every reading. Perhaps this is the point at which these many letters must be separated out. Certainly, Derrida would have us relinquish any fantasy of an identity, which is for him the ruse of mastery. I can't adjudicate this dispute, and you can surely discern my ambivalence. But I do want to understand how the master's discourse, disseminated through letters patents, generates as its reality effect a practice which assumes that there will be a reading that will always already have been inscribed within the fantasy of a return. This would be the true languishing, endlessly dead letter of apartheid, that there will be a return. Now, this is the place where formalism must cede its elegant domination, for this return is not necessarily to the sender. The philosopher's critique of the analyst's complicity with ideology does not yet address this dimension of the reality effects of the signifier's fetishization, or the sociality of the gesture that makes of every sending a kind of receipt and a partial loss. Here we will be aided more by a reading of Marcel Mauss than of Derrida's reading of his essay sur le don. The point of Mauss's essay, which I cannot fully explicate here, is that the demand for reciprocation that is so forcefully embedded in every gift does not entail a return to the sender, but implicates a third party. In his description of the Kula ring and the circulation of valuables called taonga, whose movement is enforced by the famously mysterious force called hao, Mauss notes that the whole system of reciprocities is clear, even self-evident. It, and I quote, offers but one obscurity: the intervention of a third person. This principle of the third is what makes the gift a matter exceeding every dyadic exchange, and it is literalized in the demand that some gifts in the Melanesian system must move further and further away from the original giver before they arrive apparently at their origin, but as different things that have accreted value by virtue of their movements, which are narratable and must be narrated, enclosed, as part of the biography of the things given. It is the principle of the social, which is to say the condition of possibility of recognizing the gesture and not just the alphabetic signifier, that is signified by Mauss's concept of the third person, and that he reads as the effect of the how. So I'm going to come to a conclusion. The thing about the gift, as Derrida acknowledges, is that it is not payment, nor is it just recompense. It comes as an event, a surprise. The one who says The one who receives it may say that the gift comes as it should by convention of gift-giving, but not that they deserve it. This is as true of illnesses, some of which we say can be given to others, as it is of fortuitous discovery. It's not a question of recompense, of equivocation, of economization. Gifts come from afar, de loin. In this sense, they are always purloined, but not because they have a locatable origin or a return address. Let me continue to stretch the analogy, which is more than a homology, between these various letters to suggest that the reading that is given at the chimney constitutes a kind of envelope, in which is secreted not the contents of the letter, but this fact, that the dyad is not one. There is a principle of the third here, but rather than reduce or indeed inflate this principle to a generic question of the social, as Lévi-Strauss did with the concept of exchange, we might read this postal system as the lived experience of an institution that attempts to guarantee the doubled conservation of two poles in the system of power, both of which were oriented by patriarchal legality. If the reading of the letter, poignantly full of longing or recrimination, of critique or complicity, if such a reading is itself an envelope, it is not because it inters and holds in reserve the vocalizable meaning of these asymmetrical powers, but because it dissimulates severance or partition and reconnection as relation. For connection is always a dream of relationality reduced to a principle of two, of sender and receiver, rather than of the total social fabric in all its historicity. And that fabric may or may not have been communitarian, and mainly not, and may or may not have been egalitarian, and mainly not. But we must return to a certain political literalism. Colonialism and apartheid did not merely separate people. These regimes violated the worlds over which the letters patents wrote their sovereign script. This does not mean that what preceded it was, as I said, self-same, integral, without heteronomy, without stratification, striation, difference, and conflict. But so to recognize this fact means that the effort to end the effects of colonization, which, as I have stated at the beginning, will not cease to end, cannot indulge the fantasy of a return, whether couched in neo-traditionalist terms and invested in the signifiers of culture, or in the labor movement's discourse of stabilization, which ask women to serve the purpose of permitting men to overcome the emasculations of apartheid. Both are founded on dreams of a return to patriarchal authority, in the image that was cultivated by the Chamber of Minds, for whom tribality meant, the huge literature on this, for whom tribality meant obedience to patriarchal authority, to the order of the phallic signifier. This is what Fanon was trying to repudiate in his distancing from so-called Bantu philosophy. He said, I will have nothing to do with it. And it is why the history of separation that the letters patents instituted in South Africa requires something beyond the dream of a return, and why the itinerary to the future is perhaps infinitely and inevitably purloined. But there is still time. There is yet time. There must be time to listen to what might yet be written and sent along its way. Thank you. Sorry for the length.